courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long lines across the polished wooden floor. Lawyers shuffled papers, reporters whispered to each other, and spectators filled the benches, waiting for the hearing to begin. Then the door opened. A tall man walked in calmly, his steps steady, his presence impossible to ignore. It was Muhammad Ali. Some people in the courtroom immediately recognized the legendary boxer. Others only saw a famous athlete stepping into a place where fists meant nothing and words carried all the weight. Ali wore a simple dark suit, no flashy jewelry, no loud entrance, just quiet confidence. But not everyone in the room seemed impressed. At the front of the courtroom, the judge leaned back in his chair, adjusting his glasses as he looked down at Ali. His expression slowly turned into a smirk. "So," the judge said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "this is the great Muhammad Ali." A few quiet chuckles spread through the room. The judge continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Tell me, Mr. Ali, do you plan to solve your problems here the same way you do in the boxing ring?" More laughter echoed from the back benches. For a moment, every eye in the courtroom turned toward Ali. Some expected him to get angry. Others expected him to stay silent. After all, this was a courtroom, not a stadium filled with cheering fans. But Muhammad Ali didn't react the way people expected. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. Instead, he simply stood there, calm and composed, looking directly at the judge with the same confidence he once carried into world championship fights. The judge mistook Ali's calm silence for confusion. He shook his head slightly and laughed again. "Mr. Ali," he said mockingly, "this court deals with law, not boxing. I hope you understand the difference." The spectators laughed again, louder this time. But what the judge didn't realize in that moment was that the man standing in front of him wasn't just one of the greatest fighters in history. Muhammad Ali was also known for something else: his sharp mind, powerful words, and fearless confidence. And in just a few seconds, the entire courtroom was about to witness something they would never forget. The murmurs in the courtroom slowly settled after the judge's comment, but a strange tension still hung in the air. Everyone's attention was now focused on the tall man standing quietly near the front. Muhammad Ali. Some people in the gallery leaned forward in their seats, curious about what would happen next. A few reporters quickly prepared their notebooks, sensing that this hearing might turn into something far more interesting than they had expected. Ali stood calmly, his posture relaxed but confident. He had spent years under bright lights and in front of thousands of people. Pressure was nothing new to him. But this place was different. This wasn't a boxing arena where the crowd roared and cameras flashed. This was a courtroom, a place of rules, order, and authority. At the center of it all sat the judge, still leaning back in his chair with an amused expression. He tapped his pen lightly against the desk as he studied Ali. To him, Muhammad Ali was simply a celebrity boxer who had somehow ended up standing in a legal courtroom. In his mind, fighters were known for strength, not intelligence. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr.
Ali,"
he said slowly, "before we proceed, I want to make something very clear." The room grew quiet again. This is not a place for entertainment. This is a court of law. A few people in the audience nodded, while others exchanged glances. Ali listened without interrupting. The judge continued, his tone slightly mocking. "I know you're used to crowds cheering for you in a ring, but here things work differently. Here we rely on facts, logic, and clear thinking." Another quiet ripple of laughter moved through the spectators. Some people clearly enjoyed the judge's subtle insults, but others were beginning to feel uncomfortable. They could see that Ali hadn't said a single disrespectful word. Yet the judge seemed determined to treat him as if he were nothing more than an arrogant athlete. Ali finally took a slow step forward. His expression remained calm, almost thoughtful. "Your Honor," he said politely, "I understand exactly where I am." The judge raised an eyebrow, slightly surprised that Ali had spoken so calmly. Ali continued, his voice steady and clear enough for everyone to hear. "I respect the court and the law. That's why I'm here." The courtroom became quieter. Some of the earlier smiles began to fade. Ali's words didn't sound like those of a man who was confused or intimidated. Instead, they sounded measured, deliberate. The judge noticed the change in the room. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk as he looked directly at Ali. "Well," he said, "that's good to hear." Then he added with another faint smirk, "Because talking confidently and actually proving something are two very different things." A few spectators chuckled again. But this time, the laughter was weaker. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. The judge believed he was still in control of the moment. What he didn't realize was that Muhammad Ali had spent his entire career facing people who underestimated him. In the boxing world, Many opponents once believed they could defeat him easily. They laughed, they mocked him, they underestimated him. And every single time Ali proved them wrong, not just with his fists, but with his intelligence, timing, and confidence. Now the same pattern was beginning to unfold inside this courtroom. Ali looked around the room for a brief moment. Lawyers were watching closely. Reporters had stopped whispering and were now writing quickly. Even the spectators who had laughed earlier were now waiting in silence. Then Ali slowly turned his attention back to the judge, and the next words he was about to say would change the entire tone of the courtroom. For a moment, the courtroom was completely silent. All eyes were on Muhammad Ali. The judge leaned back in his chair again, clearly expecting Ali to stumble or struggle with his words. In his mind, the situation was simple. A famous boxer had walked into a courtroom, and now he was being reminded that this was a place of law, not entertainment. But Muhammad Ali didn't look nervous. If anything, he looked more relaxed than anyone else in the room. He gently placed his hands on the table in front of him and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Your Honor," Ali said, "I understand that many people know me for boxing. That's what the world has seen." The judge nodded slowly, almost impatiently. "Well, that's exactly my point," he replied. "This court is concerned with law and reason, not speed, not strength, and certainly not showmanship." A few people in the gallery laughed again, though the sound was quieter this time. Ali heard the laughter, but he didn't react to it. Instead, he continued speaking. "But sometimes," Ali said thoughtfully, "people only see what they expect to see." The judge tilted his head slightly. "And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" he asked. Ali met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "It means that sometimes people look at a man and decide who he is before he even opens his mouth." A faint murmur moved through the courtroom. Some of the spectators shifted in their seats. The judge's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Ali," he said, tapping his pen against the desk again, "are you suggesting that this court is judging you unfairly?" Ali shook his head gently. "No, Your Honor," he replied. "I'm simply saying that respect should be given before assumptions are made." The courtroom grew even quieter. The earlier laughter had completely disappeared now. The judge straightened in his chair, clearly not expecting such a composed response. For a few seconds, he said nothing. Then he leaned forward again, folding his hands together. "Well," he said slowly, "respect is earned, Mr. Ali." Ali nodded once. "I agree," he replied. Another pause filled the room. But then the judge added something that made several people glance nervously at each other. "However," the judge continued, "fame does not automatically earn respect in a courtroom." His tone carried a clear challenge. Several spectators looked toward Ali, wondering if this was the moment he would finally lose his patience. But Muhammad Ali had built his entire career around patience, timing, and confidence. He understood something many people in that room did not. Sometimes the strongest response isn't loud. Sometimes it's calm. Ali took a slow breath and looked around the courtroom. He saw reporters watching closely. Lawyers had stopped whispering to each other. Even the court clerk had paused her writing. Everyone was waiting. Then Ali spoke again. "You're right, Your Honor," he said. "Fame doesn't earn respect." The judge nodded slightly, as if he had just proven his point. But Ali continued, "Character does." The single sentence landed in the room like a quiet thunderclap. Several spectators looked at each other in surprise. The judge blinked, clearly not expecting that answer. Ali continued speaking, still calm, still respectful. "In the ring, people judged me before the fight started," he said. "They saw a loud boxer who talked too much." Some people in the audience recognized what he was referring to. Ali had always been famous for predicting his victories and speaking boldly before fights. But the fight always showed the truth. Ali continued. The judge studied him carefully now. The mocking smile had disappeared. Ali's voice remained steady. "Your Honor, today I'm not here to fight anyone," he said. "I'm here because I believe in standing up for what's right." A few people in the gallery nodded quietly. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearly trying to regain control of the moment. "Well," he said firmly, "belief alone isn't enough in a courtroom." Ali gave a small smile. "I agree," he replied. The judge frowned slightly. Ali leaned forward just a little. "That's why I came prepared." The simple statement immediately changed the atmosphere. Lawyers exchanged curious glances. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly. "Prepared for what?" he asked. Ali calmly reached toward the folder resting on the table in front of him. The movement was slow and deliberate. For the first time since the hearing began, the judge seemed uncertain. Ali opened the folder and placed a few papers carefully on the table. The sound of the pages sliding across the wood echoed softly in the silent room. He then looked back up at the judge. "Prepared," Ali said calmly, "to speak the truth clearly." The judge stared at the documents for a moment. Something in his expression changed. For the first time since the hearing began, he no longer looked amused, and the people watching in the courtroom could feel it too. The moment that had started with laughter was slowly turning into something very different, because the judge was beginning to realize something important. The man standing in front of him was not just a boxer, and the next few minutes were about to prove it to everyone in that courtroom. The quiet sound of the papers sliding across the table echoed through the courtroom. For a brief moment, no one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the documents Muhammad Ali had placed in front of him. The judge stared at them, his earlier confidence slowly fading into curiosity. Just a few minutes ago, he had been smiling, almost amused by the presence of a famous boxer standing in his courtroom. Now, something about the situation felt different. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Ali," he said carefully, "what exactly are those documents?" Ali remained calm. He didn't rush to answer. Instead, he gently straightened the papers and looked directly at the judge. "Evidence," he replied. A quiet murmur spread through the spectators sitting behind him. Reporters immediately began writing faster, their pens scratching quickly across their notebooks. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Evidence," he repeated. "Yes, Your Honor," Ali said. "Evidence that explains why I'm standing here today." The judge glanced down at the documents again. He had expected arguments, perhaps even emotional statements. But he hadn't expected the famous boxer to walk into court with organized paperwork and a clear explanation. Slowly, he reached for the top page. As he began reading, the room remained completely silent. The judge's eyes moved carefully across the lines of text. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then, gradually, the slight confidence he had shown earlier began to disappear. Ali stood quietly, hands folded in front of him. He wasn't trying to interrupt or pressure the judge. He simply waited. Several lawyers sitting near the front began leaning forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of what the judge was reading. The judge turned the page. Then another. His pen, which he had been tapping earlier with impatience, now rested motionless on the desk. The courtroom could feel the tension growing. Finally, the judge placed the papers down and looked back at Ali. His tone was no longer mocking. "Mr. Ali," he said slowly, "where did you obtain this information?" Ali answered without hesitation. "From the same place everyone should seek truth, Your Honor." The judge frowned slightly. "And where is that?" Ali replied calmly, "From facts." A few quiet whispers moved through the room again. The judge leaned back in his chair, studying Ali more carefully now. Earlier, he had seen a celebrity boxer standing before him. But now he was looking at someone who had clearly prepared for this moment. Someone who understood exactly what he was doing. The judge cleared his throat. "Are you aware," he said, "that presenting false evidence in this courtroom would carry serious consequences?" Ali nodded respectfully. "I'm very aware of that, Your Honor." "Then you're confident these documents are accurate?" Ali gave a small smile. "I wouldn't have brought them if they weren't." Another silence fell over the room. One of the reporters in the back whispered something to the colleague beside him. Even the court clerk looked up from her desk, clearly interested in what was unfolding. The judge picked up the documents again and studied them more carefully this time. The earlier arrogance that had filled the courtroom was slowly disappearing. Now there was only tension and curiosity. After another moment of reading, the judge placed the papers back down. This time, his expression looked more serious than anyone had seen before. He looked directly at Ali. "You seem very confident, Mr. Ali." Ali nodded slightly. "Confidence comes from preparation," he replied. The judge sat quietly for a few seconds. The entire courtroom waited. Then he asked the question that everyone in the room wanted answered. "Why?" The judge said slowly. "Did you bring all of this here today?" Ali paused briefly. His answer came calmly, but every word carried weight. "Because sometimes," he said, "people make decisions about others before hearing the full truth." Several people in the gallery shifted in their seats. The judge said nothing. Ali continued. "And sometimes," he added, "the only way to correct that is to show the truth clearly." The judge looked down again at the documents. He now understood something he hadn't realized when the hearing began. Muhammad Ali hadn't walked into the courtroom unprepared. He hadn't come relying on his fame. He had come with facts. And those facts were beginning to change the entire direction of the hearing. The judge slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the desk. The room was silent again. Then he looked directly at Ali. But this time there was no smirk, no sarcasm, only seriousness. Because the judge was beginning to realize something that everyone else in the courtroom could now see clearly. He may have underestimated the wrong man, and the next moment would prove just how serious that mistake had been. The courtroom felt heavier now. The quiet tension that had been building since Muhammad Ali placed those documents on the table had spread through every corner of the room. The earlier laughter had completely disappeared. Even the judge, who had started the hearing with confidence and sarcasm, now sat silently behind his desk, studying the papers again. He lifted the first page once more and read it carefully. The sound of paper moving seemed louder than usual in the still room. Several lawyers leaned forward in their seats, clearly trying to understand what had caused such a sudden shift in the judge's attitude. Reporters in the back row were writing rapidly, sensing that the moment unfolding in front of them was far more important than anyone had expected when the hearing began. The judge finally placed the document down and looked up. His eyes moved slowly toward Muhammad Ali, but this time there was something different in his expression. No smirk, no amusement, only seriousness. Mr. Ali, the judge said slowly, "These documents suggest something very significant." Ali nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge paused for a moment, choosing his next words carefully. "According to what I'm reading here, the situation is not at all what it appeared to be at the beginning of this hearing." A soft wave of whispers moved through the spectators. The judge raised his hand slightly, and the room became silent again. He looked back at Ali. "Why?" he asked. "Did you wait until now to present this information?" Ali answered without hesitation. "Because sometimes," he said, "people need to see the truth for themselves." The judge studied him carefully. "Are you saying you allowed the misunderstanding to continue intentionally?" Ali's voice remained calm. "No, Your Honor. I simply allowed everyone the opportunity to speak before the facts spoke for themselves." That sentence hung in the air for several seconds. The judge slowly leaned back in his chair. He now realized something that had not occurred to him earlier. When the hearing began, he had assumed that Muhammad Ali would struggle to defend himself in a legal environment. He believed he was dealing with an athlete who relied on physical strength, not careful thinking. But now the situation looked completely different. Ali had come prepared. He had anticipated every question, and he had waited patiently for the right moment to reveal the truth. The judge picked up one of the pages again. "Mr. Ali," he said quietly, "if these documents are verified, they completely change the understanding of this case." Ali simply nodded. "That's why I brought them." One of the lawyers standing near the front table cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said respectfully, "may the court review the documents more closely." The judge glanced at him and then nodded.
"Yes."
The lawyer stepped forward and took the papers carefully. As he began reading, his eyebrows slowly lifted in surprise. Another lawyer leaned over his shoulder. Soon both of them were exchanging quiet looks of disbelief. The courtroom could feel that something major had just shifted. Finally, the first lawyer turned back toward the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "these records appear to be accurate." The judge's face tightened slightly. He looked again at Muhammad Ali. For the first time since the hearing began, there was no trace of mockery in his voice. "Mr. Ali," he said, "it appears that I may have formed an opinion before hearing all the facts." Ali didn't react dramatically. He didn't smile. He didn't try to embarrass the judge. Instead, he answered in the same calm tone he had used since the beginning. "It happens to all of us sometimes, Your Honor." The humility in his response surprised several people in the room. The judge slowly nodded. Then he took a deep breath. When this hearing began, he admitted, "I believed I understood the situation." He paused, "But it is now clear that I did not." The courtroom was completely silent. Reporters stopped writing for a moment, simply watching, because something rare was happening. A judge who had mocked a man only minutes earlier was now recognizing that he had been wrong. The judge folded his hands together on the desk. "Mr. Ali," he said, "your explanation and the documents you presented have clarified many things." Ali simply stood quietly. The judge then said something no one in the room expected. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I underestimated you." A faint ripple moved through the spectators. But Muhammad Ali's response was simple. He nodded respectfully and said, "Respect is something we all learn, Your Honor." Those words settled into the room like a quiet lesson. And at that moment, everyone in the courtroom realized something important. Muhammad Ali hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't argued. He hadn't fought. Yet somehow he had completely changed the direction of the entire courtroom. And the final decision that would follow next would leave an even deeper impression on everyone watching. The courtroom remained silent after Muhammad Ali's final words. For several long seconds, no one moved. The tension that had filled the room earlier had transformed into something else entirely, a quiet respect that seemed to settle over everyone present. The judge sat still behind his desk, his hands folded together as he looked down at the documents once more. Only a short time ago he had been laughing. Now his expression was serious, thoughtful. He slowly lifted his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, as if taking a moment to reflect on everything that had just happened. Across the room, the spectators watched carefully. The lawyers remained silent. Even the reporters had paused their writing. Everyone understood that the next words spoken in the courtroom would matter. Finally, the judge straightened in his chair and looked toward Muhammad Ali again. "Mr. Ali," he began, his voice calmer than before, "this court exists to examine facts and deliver fair judgment." Ali nodded respectfully. The judge continued, "And it is also the responsibility of the court to ensure that every individual is treated with fairness and dignity." The meaning behind those words was clear to everyone listening. The judge paused briefly before continuing. "When this hearing began," he said slowly, "I allowed my assumptions to influence my attitude." A quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. It was rare to hear a judge openly acknowledge something like that. The judge took another breath. "I saw a famous boxer standing before me," he admitted, "and I believed that was the only thing that defined you." Ali remained calm, listening without interrupting. "But today," the judge continued, "you have demonstrated something that deserves recognition." He gestured toward the documents on the desk. "You came prepared with facts, evidence, and a clear understanding of the situation." He paused again. "And you did so with patience and respect." Several people in the audience nodded quietly. The judge then looked directly at Ali. "For that, you have the court's respect." Those words echoed softly through the room. For a moment no one spoke. Then the judge reached for his pen and wrote a few notes on the document in front of him. After signing the paper, he placed it down firmly. "This court will review the information you have provided and proceed accordingly," he announced. But one thing is already clear. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward slightly. The judge looked around the room before speaking again. Respect should never depend on a person's profession, appearance, or reputation. He then turned back toward Muhammad Ali. "And today, Mr. Ali, you have reminded this court of that principle." Ali gave a small, respectful nod. He didn't celebrate. He didn't try to make the moment about himself. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge studied him for another moment. Then something unexpected happened. The judge stood up. The sudden movement caused a few people in the courtroom to shift in surprise. Judges rarely stood during hearings unless something important was happening. He looked at Ali once more. "Mr. Ali," he said, "this court appreciates the way you handled this situation." His voice carried a tone of sincerity that had been completely absent at the beginning of the hearing. "You have conducted yourself with dignity." The courtroom remained quiet, but the atmosphere had completely changed. The same man who had walked into the courtroom and been greeted with laughter was now standing there, with the respect of everyone present. The judge finally nodded toward the courtroom doors. "This session is concluded." A soft wave of movement spread through the spectators as people slowly began standing up. Reporters quickly resumed writing, already preparing the story they would publish later that day. Lawyers exchanged quiet remarks. But many of the people in the gallery kept glancing toward Muhammad Ali, because they had just witnessed something unusual. A confrontation that could have turned into anger had instead become a moment of calm strength and dignity. Ali quietly gathered the documents from the table. He placed them back into his folder and turned toward the exit. As he began walking toward the doors, several people in the room stepped slightly aside to let him pass. Not because they had been told to, but because, in that moment, they felt something simple yet powerful: respect. And as Muhammad Ali walked out of the courtroom, the silence that followed him carried a message stronger than any argument. True strength isn't always shown through power. Sometimes, it's shown through patience, intelligence, and the courage to stand calmly when others expect you to fall. And the final lesson from that day would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the feeling in the air lingered long after the hearing ended. People walked out in quiet conversations, still thinking about what they had just witnessed. Just an hour earlier, many of them had entered the courtroom expecting an ordinary legal hearing. Instead, they had seen something unforgettable. A moment that began with laughter and mockery had turned into a powerful lesson about respect. Muhammad Ali stepped out into the bright daylight outside the courthouse. Reporters quickly followed, hoping to ask questions. Cameras flashed. Microphones were raised, but Ali didn't rush to speak. He paused for a moment on the courthouse steps, looking calm and thoughtful, just as he had been inside the courtroom. One reporter finally spoke up. "Mr. Ali," he asked, "how did you stay so calm when the judge mocked you earlier?" Several other reporters leaned closer, waiting for his answer. Ali smiled gently. "The The same way I stayed calm in the boxing ring, he replied. The reporters looked curious. Ali continued. In boxing, if you lose your temper, you lose your focus. He paused briefly before adding something that made several people nod in agreement. And when you lose your focus, you lose the fight. Another reporter raised his hand. Did the judge's comments make you angry? Ali shook his head slowly. No, he said, because anger doesn't solve problems. Understanding does. The crowd of reporters grew quiet. Ali's voice remained calm, but every word carried meaning. Sometimes people judge others too quickly, he continued. They see a title, a job, or a reputation, and they think they know everything about that person. A few people standing nearby nodded quietly. Ali glanced back toward the courthouse doors behind him. But respect shouldn't depend on what someone does for a living, he said. It should depend on how we treat each other. One of the younger reporters asked another question. Do you think the judge learned something today? Ali smiled again. I think we all did, he replied. Those simple words spread through the small crowd standing outside the courthouse. Because what had happened inside that courtroom wasn't just about one judge and one famous boxer. It was about something bigger. A reminder that assumptions can be dangerous. And that true strength doesn't always come from power or authority. Sometimes it comes from patience. From staying calm when others expect you to react with anger. From letting the truth speak for itself. Muhammad Ali had done exactly that. He hadn't shouted, he hadn't argued. He hadn't tried to embarrass anyone. Instead, he showed confidence, preparation, and dignity. And in doing so, he turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson that everyone present would remember. As the reporters slowly stepped back, Ali began walking toward his car. Before getting inside, he turned back for one last moment. If there's one thing people should remember, he said, who's this? The reporters lifted their microphones again. Ali looked around at the crowd and spoke clearly. Never underestimate someone just because they look different from what you expected. He opened the car door and added one final thought. Because the strongest people aren't always the loudest. With that, Muhammad Ali stepped into the car and quietly drove away, and the story of that courtroom moment spread far beyond the courthouse walls. It became a reminder repeated by many people afterward. A reminder that respect should be given to everyone, not just to those with titles or power. Because one day, the person you underestimate might be the person who teaches you the most important lesson of all.